Trump at the United Nations, the Senate health care bill, and Hillary explains what happened. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is The Square Circle.
If you have a passion for helping people, want to launch a new charity, or need to raise funds, Voluntary Solutions can help. You have a passion for helping people. We have a passion for helping you. Visit voluntarysolutionsdc.com, 844-739-5488.
Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Joining us today are Stephenie Foster of Smash Strategies, Charlie Katebi of Young Voices, and conservative writer and editor Brian McNicoll. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
President Trump made his first appearance before the United Nations General Assembly this week. Here are some highlights of his speech.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. Just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. The scourge of our planet today is a small group of rogue regimes that violate every principle on which the United Nations is based. They respect neither their own citizens nor the sovereign rights of their countries.
So, conservative writer and editor Brian McNicoll, how do you think President Trump did with his first speech at the United Nations?
It was a different kind of speech than we're used to hearing. It was classic Trump. We were talking earlier. It was a classic American president speech. He called out the bad guys. He promised strong action. He called for reform. He was more direct about calling out the bad guys at something. But he also made a case for sovereignty, for the nation state, for countries to be countries, for people for patriotism, which a lot of time we look at that and, it gets called nationalism and it's viewed as a negative, but he's saying it's a positive. Be for your country. He urged the leaders of the world to be for their countries. You advocate for your country, we'll advocate for our country, and the process of that will have mutual interests that we can move toward peace. So I thought that was a real interesting piece of it. You don't hear a lot of defense for like Westphalian nation state anymore. And I thought it was an important thing, and it's an important time for it.
Well, Charlie Katebi of Young Voices, what do you think?
I think it sounded a little dangerous, the way that he was calling out North Korea that way, calling out their leader by name, calling him Rocket Man. And it is dangerous in that we're trying to de-escalate that situation that's been going on for decades now. We have nuclear weapons aimed at Seoul, just 30 miles away. So I think we need to be a little bit more calmer and a little bit more diplomatic when we're dealing with tensions that are this high.
Oh, and Stephenie Foster of Smash Strategies, your opinion?
Well, I was at the State Department for 5 years, and so really I was at the UN General Assembly a number of times and have worked in this arena for a number of years. So I would agree. I mean, I think that the question for me is what works to get someone like the leader of North Korea to the negotiating table. And I'm not sure that the kind of rhetoric that seems like name-calling is really the right way to go. I think sanctions really help. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about where we are with the sanctions regime, and I know that some new sanctions were announced today, which I think is good, and I think we've seen from both Republican and Democratic administrations that really pushing that can have a really big effect on North Korea. And so to me, I think the question has to be, what really helps us get someone like that to the table? And also think about that in the context of the rest of what's going on in the world. We have a lot of things going on in the world. It's kind of a hard time, tough time, lots of conflict, and how do we prioritize what we need to do? And so I think there are some things that most people would agree on, the need for UN reform and that kind of thing, but I worry about being so, what I consider to be somewhat bellicose about one person and really just trying to figure out how to get that person to really have a conversation in a negotiating posture that gets us to where we want to be.
I wrote a piece today that said the part of what happened here is he essentially has given up on the notion of getting him to the table, and his strategy is, to warn the heck out of him, so to speak, to, if we're not going to try to talk you out of this and negotiate you out of this. We're going to tell you that if you do it, you'll be in big trouble, and for better or for worse. And I don't know, but the other stuff hasn't worked either. I mean, this is a tough nut to crack, and you also have the problem of, Seoul, 24 million people, is about 30, 40 miles below the DMZ. So anything you do, they're in artillery range. They don't even need ballistic missiles. Not an issue, right? They can be fired upon immediately by the North Koreans. So it's a tough nut. It's not an easy situation.
Well, he talked, certainly North Korea was a big part of his speech, but Iran was also something that he was very bellicose about. Charlie, do you have an opinion on his approach to Iran?
I think it's a lot easier to be so much more bellicose to a country, against a country that you oppose that does not have nuclear weapons. It's a lot easier. We can go in there like what we did with Iraq or Libya without the collateral consequences that would happen if we were to try that with North Korea. And it's hard. How do you actually, you can talk tough, you can make these threats, but how do you actually turn that into something successful without 24 million people in Seoul just being vaporized at the end of the day?
Well, I think the other thing to say about that is, there was a meeting today where, and there's some controversy over what actually happened in this meeting, but where all the, the EU and the P5 parties agreed that Iran has complied with the terms of the agreement. So I think, looking at that in terms of how that impacts the politics and decisions by the president, I think is really important. I will also say, just hearkening back to Korea a little bit, it's not just the people in Seoul. There are 25 million people who live in North Korea, and their leader is not someone that we agree with. It's somebody that we need to really figure out how to kind of bring to bear, but those people are also people who essentially the speech is saying we're going to vaporize you. And I think it's a very unusual thing to go to the UN as a president and say we're basically going to annihilate an entire country, as opposed to talking about taking out the leadership of a country or getting them to the table. So I think that's also something to keep in mind.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you for that. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter. And we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Also this week, Senate Republicans are making a last-ditch effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. Here's the story from Watch It News.
A group of Senate Republicans on Wednesday rolled out a last-ditch effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. The bill was written by Senators Lindsey Graham, Bill Cassidy, Dean Heller, and Ron Johnson. It would primarily allocate federal funding for health care in block grants to states. The plan would be a change from the current system that allocates money based on a percentage of what states spend. Graham touted the idea as a way to give flexibility on health care spending to states.
Well, Charlie Katebi of Young Voices, do the positives of this bill outweigh the negatives?
Absolutely. We are fast approaching a deadline coming up on September 30th, and that's when the window to pass any sort of health care reform through a majority vote closes. So we have two choices right now. We can go straight through that window of opportunity and keep Obamacare, keep the premium increases, keep trapping people in Medicaid, which provides them worse health care, oftentimes than even being uninsured. Or you can go with this plan that really is something for everybody. If you love Obamacare, if you live in a state like California, New York, or Maryland, you can keep under this bill everything you like exactly as it is. The regulations, the rules on pre-existing conditions, the Medicaid expansion, all of that. But if you're a state like Texas, Arizona, or Florida, that has really seen your insurance markets collapse and premiums increase for your patients, you can actually have a lot more control to remove those regulations that are harming people, particularly millennials, and really bring a lot more choice and competition and actually make healthcare affordable. So I think just given the options between the ACA and this bill, I think this bill is definitely a step in the right direction.
And Stephenie Foster of Smash Strategies, what's your take on this?
Well, I'd say a couple things. I just respectfully disagree, of course. You might not be surprised. I think on two levels. I mean, one thing is I think the process question is a very big question. I worked in the Senate as well. And, you know, I feel this is a little bit like Groundhog Day. We're talking again about trying to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act with very little process. In fact, less process this time than really I think the last couple of times. And that's really, I think, a concern because there's a lot in the bill that people are still working out.
To see what's in it.
They're unclear. Yeah, right, that's the problem. And so I feel like, you know, it's a little bit like we've been here before. I do think there are other efforts ongoing to really try to help fix the Affordable Care Act, to really address some of the issues. I think there are some questions about whether pre-existing conditions actually will be covered in those states, and I think that's part of this issue with the process not being really clear. I think another big concern is really looking at how this would affect the insurance markets. I think that's also not clear. We've had some of the big insurers coming out and saying the markets are now, they're uncomfortable with where they see the markets might be because of a lack of clarity. So I think the process is a problem. I think the policy is a problem. I think it takes away money from states that have invested in the Affordable Care Act and have invested in those exchanges. I'd also say one last thing, and I feel, given my background, you know, this is, again, we have another bill that are crafted by 4 men, and we're looking at provisions in there that take out maternity care. And so we really need to I think, be very honest about what is this bill, what's the process, and how can we have a debate about it that the American people can be part of.
And Brian McNicoll.
I think it's exciting. It returns all this decision making to the states where, you know, you have that debate with someone you can know and vote out of office and, you know, actually talk to, get on the phone and so forth. And you're going to have, you know, when, you know, the states responded the last time to this, you know, with a variety of solutions, right, that didn't look alike at all. And some of them looked like they were pretty healthy, possible, doable things that sort of got wiped away as, you know, as Obamacare fell apart. Kentucky was one of them, South Carolina, Kansas. So you have a chance to get that creativity going again. You know, Texas will do something big and wacky. New York and California will be single payer or close to it. California, there was a bill in the Senate a few months ago. They tried to go single payer, almost passed. They would have, but I think the governor, they priced it and decided they couldn't afford it. Now you would have more of a chance of affording it. I think the Republicans, from a political standpoint, you know, pay Lisa whatever it is she charges. Just give her the money and get it over the finish line. Because you're running out of chances to do this, and this is an exciting, you know, stark change from something that wasn't working.
Well, I think it's unclear about the money and in terms of what the states will get and how they can rely on that. I think the other thing is, I think, you know, we see in July the polls all showed that only about 13% of Americans wanted to fully repeal and replace the ACA. And so I think there's a lot of appetite out there for a better discussion about how to improve the system that's been put in place and not rush to judgment on where to go next.
And Charlie, I'd love to hear from you about, you know, your opinion on this, especially considering that you're with young advocates, what the youth think of this.
Well, if you're worried, if we want more of a discussion, then this doesn't close the discussion. It begins the discussion because it sends the money straight back to the states, all the Medicaid expansion funding, all the exchange funding, and it lets states decide. And we can have that discussion. If you're like California or Massachusetts, and you're really liking what Bernie Sanders has been talking about single payer, demolishing the insurance market, and putting all the power in the hands of the state to administer your health care, they can do that. They can take that Medicaid expansion block grant and basically create a single payer program. And then for those other states, they can take that and more target that funding directly to their patients. People like to talk about what's going to happen to all those patients that are on Medicaid. Well, bear in mind that people on Medicaid have terrible access to their doctors. Their doctors, the Medicaid program pays doctors so little that in many states, half the doctors refuse to accept them. So we could really have a way to basically provide them private health insurance in a way that the ACA did not do. and really allow them to have better access to their doctors.
Do you think that it's the government's job, though, to set standards? For instance, pre-existing conditions, that was something that the country was so excited that was a government standard now that had to be upheld.
Absolutely, yeah. Sure.
Well, the discussion's gone both ways. They're sort of saying that is in there, that they're going to do it. But the problem is, pre-existing conditions is not insurance, right? Because insurance, the insurance, they charge 10 of us so much. One of us gets sick, we take all that money and we pay to get the one person sick. Well, right? Okay. Pre-existing conditions, you're saying you're ordering the insurer to take a loss on every single one of them. They know they're going to pay out more in premiums more in payments to providers than they're going to get in premiums.
And Charlie, it looks like you had a response to that.
Yeah, I really want to, no, I really want to clarify this. I've heard so many different things on both sides about whether this will cover pre-existing conditions or not. Here's the thing. If you take the funding and keep Obamacare exactly the way it is, then you'll stick with Obamacare, the way it protects patients. And the way it does that, supposedly, is that it basically says insurers have to accept them and they can't charge them based on their health. What this does is it gives the money back to the states. And if you want to get rid of those rules, you can, but only if you set up a different way to protect those people with pre-existing conditions. And there are much better ways to deal with those patients. And what many states have done is actually set up a high-risk pool, which basically is a pot of money basically to cover the medical expenses of really sick people with...
There's some talk of like growing the pools by multiple states coming together.
Exactly, yeah. And a lot of people, there's a lot of misinformation about this, but one state really did this well, Maine. A few years ago, what they did was they set aside a pool of money, and whenever somebody's medical expenses rose above, say, $12,000, it kicked in, and this really worked. So there were a lot of ideas like these that we could have and discussions.
All right, well, thank you all. And finally, Hillary Clinton was back in the news this week with her new book, What Happened?, which chronicles why she thinks she lost the 2016 election. But critics are pointing out that she takes little, if any, blame herself. So, Stephenie Foster of Smash Strategies, what do you think that Hillary is looking to gain with this book?
Well, I'd say a couple things. I mean, I think she really is wanting to put out her views about what happened, talking about her perceptions and her feelings and how this impacted her. She talks a lot about taking responsibility at the very beginning of the book. So the critics aside, I think she does accept that this is her campaign, that the decisions were made were her responsibility. I do think one thing to say is a lot went on. And if she had, and to point out, of course, 3 million more people voted for Hillary than voted for the president. The Electoral College was a different story, but she did sort of essentially win the popular vote. And so I think what you see is if we'd been looking backwards in a case where she'd won, a lot of this would be a different kind of conversation. And so she takes responsibility for some of the decisions that get made, but there are other things that were at play. There was sort of, I think, an incessant interest by the media in covering scandal when they were covering Hillary Clinton and covering more issue-based conversations when they were covering Donald Trump. There was the sort of Comey investigation, and now what we don't know yet, but about Russian interference in the election. One interesting thing is there's a Harvard study that just came out about a month ago, and they studied like the number of sentences that news media said about each candidate. And when you look at the difference between what people said, the media said about Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, it's overwhelmingly that the number of sentences discussing Hillary Clinton were around sort of emails and things like that, and around, for Donald Trump, around immigration and jobs. So I think there really were other things going on besides whatever happened in her campaign. And look, when you win a campaign, it sort of masks a lot of things that happened that also could have, if you'd lost, you would say those were things that led to your campaign being unsuccessful. So I think she's really trying to get the word out there about her perceptions. She's gotten, a lot of big audiences to hear her story. It's a best-selling book. So I think it's a conversation that she wants to be part of. Others are going to be writing about the campaign. Others have already. And I think she believes that she needs to get her perceptions and her views into this conversation.
Did you have a response, either of you, with that?
One thing that I don't think got enough attention And I was watching this the whole time during the election, okay? From, you know, there was all these polls. She's at 11 ahead, she's 9 ahead, she's 4 ahead, she's 7 ahead, right? Okay, but from $35,000 a year to $75,000 a year, he was 17, 18, 19 points ahead. He was also ahead by 10 to 11.
What does that mean, $35,000 a year to
earnings of that
$75,000?
house, of that household earnings.
Oh, I see. Okay,
35,000.
okay.
People earning 35,000 up to 75,000. He was like 17 ahead. From 75 to 125, he was like 9 or 10 ahead. That's the middle class of America, right? 35 to 125. That's a broad swath of the middle class, and you know, so you know, when you look at all these things, who covered what and so forth, you got to take into mind the people, the broad swath of people who work and earn money, because it's hard to earn 35,000 without having some kind of job, right? You did not support her. That's what she lost. She lost badly. She didn't just lose; she lost badly. And I don't think it's dealt with.
And it was interesting that she didn't really address how she failed to address or even visit a lot of the places that were really have really been struggling over the past few years, as deindustrialization has been happening, as policies and the market have been driving coal out. There have been a lot of communities that have been really hit hard. And if you really look at Trump and Hillary, for better or worse, Trump reached out to those people, and he promised, for how hollow or solid those promises were, he made them believe that he had a way to actually help those people. And I don't think that she really addressed the failure to reach those people in her book.
Well, I think looking at her campaign decisions, you know, again, that's part of what was going on. I think it's very easy to focus on some of those things now. I also think one interesting thing is really, which she talks about in the book, sort of her, she admits, you know, she became, because she is very focused on governing, like looking at how would, so say with the college for all, you know, policy proposals that Bernie Sanders had, how would we pay for that? And got very focused on how the governing part of it would work. Whereas I think one thing you see is that in campaigns and elections, it's sometimes more about the big ideas, right? People respond to, you know, these broader themes about what you're going to do to make my life better, like why should I care and why should I vote for you kind of answer. So I think in some ways she does admit this very fundamental thing that's very true about her, I think, that she cares so much about governing that in some ways, says this in the book, she gets kind of lost in that. And so I think, again, I think this is a really a good, you know, opportunity for her to tell that part of the story. And I think people are responding, and sure, there'll be a debate about what she says, but I think this is her time to tell that story.
All right, thank you. Now it's time to take some questions from our viewers. We'll start with Lindsay Grant. Are the Republicans just trying to pass something, or does this bill really reflect their policy principles? Who would like to take that question?
I think it's dead center of their policy principles of returning power, devolving power to the states. They say that all the time. They don't always honor it, but here in this one case, they are. They're saying the best thing is to get the decision making out of Washington.
Well, I would say this, though. I mean, obviously, there's a September 30th deadline, and to look at being able to pass a bill with only 50 votes and not needing 60 votes. And so I think this is being driven by that deadline. In fact, just a week ago, there really wasn't, you know, a Graham bill in the works. Now there is, and it's being rushed through. So I think you can look at it a lot of different ways. But the deadline is looming out there, and I think that does have a tremendous impact on what's going on. I think, just again, as someone who worked, I'm always very hesitant when people are passing things very quickly without really taking the time to have a process. And one thing John McCain said when he voted against the bill during the summer was that he wanted to return to regular order. This is certainly not regular order in any way, shape, or form.
Charlie?
If we were having this discussion about Cassidy-Graham in February of this year or March of this year, I would say that yes, these are conservative ideas and conservative think tanks, and now they're discussing them. But we have gone back and forth. This might be the 4th or 5th bill in the Senate that's being discussed. They had no idea what they were going to put up if and when Trump came. So I think this is really a Hail Mary right now. I like the bill. I think this is far better than the ACA, but I really wish they put more thought into what exactly they wanted to turn our healthcare system into.
All right, thank you. And now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. And who would like to start with that?
I'm happy to start.
Okay, great.
You know, I think the most underreported story of the week is something that's been the most underreported story for really several months, which is that there are 4 countries in Africa that are experiencing extreme famine: Somalia, Nigeria, Yemen, which is of course not in Africa, and South Sudan. And these are places where there's just the droughts are tremendous. Famine is really having a huge impact, and I think that's it's underreported and really important, because those are breeding grounds for people who don't like us when there's instability, fragility, and conflict. And so I think we really need to focus on that as we're focusing on all these other things happening in the world. How do we get aid to those people so that we can create some stability in those countries?
How do we keep our eye on that? And conservative writer and editor Brian McNicoll.
The Interior Department is going to, they're studying ways to reduce the size of some of the Antiquities Act designations that President Obama made at the end of his term. There was one in Utah called Bears Ears. The state, the environmental groups, the state government, the federal, the congressional representatives of Utah all agreed, you know, of how this land should be used. All the elected representatives of the people. At the end of his term, President Obama went against what they wanted, declared it all off limits to any kind of development, any kind of grazing, and so forth. And after all the state leaders had agreed otherwise, now what they're talking about is how to reduce it back to the size where the deal the state leaders made, the people closest to the government, people closest to the people they're governing made, can be implemented.
Charlie Katebi with Young Advocates.
So the Brookings Institute just released a massive survey they did about where they asked college students about their feelings on the First Amendment and on free speech on campus. And they asked them, if somebody's coming and they're offensive and just very disagreeable, can you use is it acceptable to use violence against them? And what they found, and what this is interesting, is that it was pretty evenly split. Both Democrats and Republicans, a fifth of them, 21 to 20%, supported, thought that it was acceptable to use violence against speech that they thought was profane or really attacked their sensibilities. And what was also strange is that they didn't even understand what the First Amendment was. 40%, both Republican and Democrat students, thought that hate speech was not protected under the First Amendment.
40%.
40%, 39 to 41. That was the cutoff between Republicans and Democrats. Yeah, and it's really troubling that this is the millennial generation that's coming up. It's going to be entering the workforce, entering careers with this misunderstanding of what our Constitution protects and what it does not. So,
I'm curious about the 20, but it's encouraging, I guess, that only 20% actually seem to think that violence is acceptable under these conditions. That means that 80% do not. Did I get that
80%
percentage
Yeah,
correct?
that's 20%. Not a good number.
Okay.
If a fifth of the people think that it's okay to go beat up a speaker because they say something you disagree with. That's a big problem on our college campuses. What's going on is like they're told, you know, don't ever do like what we're doing here. Don't listen to people who disagree with you. Shut them up, shout them down. That was another thing that was in that study. It was acceptable to like more than 40% to shout them down. To just a speaker you disagree with, just go in there and make noise till they can't hear it. Yeah. It was a scary study. It's Brookings.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, the whole civil rights movement was based on nonviolent protest. Yes. I remember watching the documentaries of them learning how to be nonviolent and how to not respond. How can we get back to that form of protest and remind the country of its success?
I mean, one thing I think is really interesting, and it goes a little bit to your point, and I haven't read the study, is that we don't require civics now in every school. Right. It depends on the state, and those classes in some places have been taken out because of funding, and I would argue that actually we need to get civics classes back in every single classroom in America, just for this reason, because we can have a discussion, and we disagree on things, but this is a very nice conversation where we're not, you know, shouting over each other or thinking about doing horrible things to each other. And I think we need to get back to a place where people really understand our institutions of government, so that these discussions can be really based on facts and things that people can agree on.
Great. All right. Well, that's all for this week. I'm Heather Godwin, and thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week. Thank you all.